NUAA is a peer-based drug user organisation funded primarily by the New South Wales Ministry of Health. We advocate for the health, human rights and dignity of people who use or have used illicit drugs, including those either on or seeking treatment. If we want to provide really excellent health care for people who use drugs, we need to tackle stigma and discrimination. People experience stigma when they feel a sense of rejection based on a personal characteristic, in this case, drug use. Stigma is the attitude and discrimination is the behavior, but discrimination can take many forms. Research shows us that stigma and discrimination lead to poor health outcomes. People avoiding care, dropping out of treatment, and only seeking treatment when very unwell. These videos are people who use drugs talking about positive and negative experiences of healthcare.
So have I felt ashamed? Yes, I had one experience where I felt deeply ashamed. It was actually quite awful. So it was with my methadone prescriber. It was like a father scolding, getting cranky with their child, and I was silent, and I think he felt the silence. And then what came out of his mouth was, well, now that your mother's dead, someone has to tell you. My mother had died a few months previously.
When you fill the forms out and you're treated pretty normal until you put maybe that you have Aboriginal descent.
I was actually assaulted in a park in Newtown and received a couple of stab wounds, and I had to go down to emergency and ended up in the hospital. And they put the bracelets on you to identify you and your allergies. And I noticed I had a third one that other people didn't have, and had a good close look at that. It had a biohazard symbol on it. And that was specifically because I had a hepatitis C infection. So that made me feel ashamed.
Go from, I'll say they'll binge drink, but I'll say like, oh, it's a couple of times a week that I have more than 10 standards, but when it's more than that. It's the same with smoking cigarettes, it's the same with any drugs. I will always reduce the amount. So they kind of know what I'm about without really knowing the extent of it. And I think it's because I've seen the shock on some doctors' faces when I feel judged by these doctors to feel ashamed, and then I reveal less and less.
Yes, I did feel a bit ashamed. The help wasn't really there. I didn't want it to be, the stigma was, I didn't want my family to find out, but the doctor had to call my mum and let her know. So that was a letdown, because what about the privacy between doctor and the patient?
Oh, so you're a junkie. That was one comment I got when I explained I'm on an opioid treatment program. First thing one of the nurses said, oh, you're a junkie. Not you're a drug user or you're an addict, you're a junkie. And I said, I think that's a bit derogatory. I'm a drug user and it's no different to someone who's an alcohol drinker. She said, oh, that's ridiculous, that's legal. I said, yeah, that's right, isn't it funny? It's legal and it's one of the worst drugs. And she was like, and, took off, and like I buzzed up a few times, and that was when I was in hospital, and they just took 40 minutes to come and things like that. Whereas everyone else would buzz and they'd be there straight away. So little things like that I do notice.
Junkie, that's the worst thing. That's the worst thing you can do to someone that's addicted to drugs.
I've heard the label intravenous drug user thrown around when I've actually been into emergency again for an accident where I actually fell out of a tree picking avocados and damaged my back quite severely. And I was asking about pain medication, and they said to me, we're worried about you giving you morphine because you are an intravenous drug user. We don't want to compound any problems. And I really couldn't understand that. I had a heroin habit, for want of a better word, at the time, and a little bit of morphine wasn't going to wasn't going to set me off.
I've overheard things along the lines of, she still uses, in the tone, it's in the delivery, and it's quite often because they're in a professional setting and you're not, the way they use that tone and those words is like clearly differentiating you from them.
Language has real power. It absolutely has real power, and the way we use language is really important. So things like, we've moved away from talking about the diabetic or the asthmatic or the addict. Those things encapsulate the person as this thing, this is who they are. And it stops us, it implies that change isn't possible. So really shifting that language to a person who has this thing, you know, a person who has dependence, a person who has diabetes, a person who has a problem with gambling, are a much better way, because it really is that person-centred language, which is around acknowledging that that person is a unique soul with a multi-dimensional life that is not just their particular issue that they're coming to us with.
That whole stigma of what a certain drug user looks like, and then how they're going to behave and how they're going to act. And that's where a lot of that judgment comes from, for sure.
Judgment is another big one that I'm hypersensitive to, because there is so much judgment, stigma, dirty looks, disgusted looks when one is a drug user out in society.
I used to go to a practice just because it was local, and it had a big sign on the door saying we don't know benzos prescribed, or we don't prescribe benzos or something, and that immediately put me on the back foot. It felt like it was really policing behavior and the kind of person who was welcome, and that means that made me feel like there's parts of me and my behavior that would be suspect.
So they actually didn't take my blood on a couple of occasions when they could have, like it wasn't impossible. But yeah, and then the doctor had said this would be a lot easier if you weren't a drug user. So it was easier just to sit at home and just be like, oh, and I missed a lot of appointments just because of that stigma there that I didn't actually want to attend from that first experience that I had. But I also knew deep down, okay, well, I sort of need to. I've been told that this could develop into cancerous cells and it needs to be monitored. So I did go and find a different general practitioner that was really, really good.
It's questions about about how it might affect my life, or asking me things like if it's affecting my work, or if it's affecting my social life, but like kind of just, I guess, intrusive questions, like things that aren't necessarily about the problem, but they feel involvement in speaking on. Prefer them to not ask. I mean, like, unless it's something that I'm bringing up as an issue, or if it's something that I'm already being treated for in one instance, then I don't think it's necessarily that doctor's business on what's happening. Like, if they're there to treat me for one thing and the other thing isn't directly involved, then I don't think it's necessarily their job to be commenting on it.
It's really important that we understand that drug use is not everything, and that there may well be other things that are going on that are equal or of more importance. And if the drug use has been in the past, if it's not part of that person's life now, that's another story. It's not, and that's one of the things that I see really commonly is, you know, and it seems to come, you know, person age 32, drug user. It's like, yeah, but that was 20 years ago. So that's not at the top of the list. It shouldn't be at the top of the list unless it deserves to be there. But you've got to have good clinical reasons. You've got to fit it in to the real clinical context.
It makes you feel bad. It makes you, it takes you actually back to your bad days, what you were doing. Even though if you sort yourself out and you're doing better now.
Awkward. I feel like I'm dumb. I feel like they're deliberately doing it to make me feel dumb and awkward.
It makes you think twice about being honest with the registrar or the nurse or the doctor. I'm a mature person and I want the best healthcare I can get at my age. And to be second guessing what you've got to say, to being shamed about when you get a question, I see you've had a previous hepatitis C infection, you know, how did you get that? You know, like, were you sharing dirty needles? That's not what was said, but that's the insinuation. So it makes me think twice. It makes me be not so much dishonest, but not open.
For me, coming from a cold community background, how people, they don't like to be judged. They rather end their life than be called names and people knowing about them, the community knowing about them. That's a stigma right now.
I'm quite selective with the doctors that I choose, due to judgmental experiences in the past. I've been quite selective about what doctors I do and go see.
And I see all the time the way that stigma and discrimination adversely affects people. It affects their health generally. It affects their access to services. And I see the way it plays out and the internalised stigma, how people take these identities on and start to believe that it's who they are and how that affects them and how it affects the way they access care. And everybody, no matter where you come from, no matter what you look like, no matter what your name is, no matter what your background is, have a right to have really high quality care, and that stigma stops that happening.
Lifestyle factors is what I would prefer to hear than drug addict or drug dependent. So what's your lifestyle factors, or what, is there any lifestyle factors that can contribute to your health? Because we all know that it does affect your health. So I don't know, I think that's a nicer way to say it, is lifestyle factors.
And I've certainly had times where I've used language where I've then become aware that the person's it's meant something different to what I've intended it. Or I've said something because I work within a culture and I haven't realised the impact that has on an individual. And so I think it's really important as a healthcare worker when you realise, oh goodness, that something I've said didn't gel for that person, to say, I'm terribly sorry, I'm just noticing that maybe that word I used or that phrase I used maybe had an impact that I didn't intend. I want to apologise for any impact it's had. Can we work on that? Can we understand that?
And if I come there and you're sitting down and you're looking at me up and down, what is that going to say to me? Okay, she's judging me. What am I going to think about? Escape. Run away before you get attacked. So that's what I'm going to think. That's what happened when I went to DAMAC first time. Tommy was on the thing. And I was actually shaking because parole sent me there. So I'm looking, this guy looked at me and goes, oh, good morning. Ahmed, do you need anything? I'm making you a coffee. Would you like a biscuit with it? And I just sat down, I'm like, okay, I'm in the right place. People are nice.
I think one of the most important things is really to actually sit there, make eye contact and listen. Don't continue on doing other things while the conversation is happening. And I think one of the really important things for doctors is don't assume that you know something about me because I've got a drug history, because you probably don't. So communication is the key, and having that feel of respect too, because us as drug users, we will respect a medical professional if they respect us and meet us in the middle.
A non-judgmental style of talking and interacting is hugely important, because it means that people are given space to actually really talk about what's going on for them. And we know, it's really clear, the literature is really clear on this, that it helps people to access treatment, access it early, stay in treatment and have better outcomes from their treatment itself.
I'd love for doctors to encourage you to identify as Aboriginal, to let them know, okay, this is what drugs I've been using, because that it can be relevant to your treatment, what's wrong with you or whatever. And people are skipping those things because they feel that the doctors are going to be judging them. So I don't think that a lot of people are getting proper medical treatment because they're not disclosing the whole information. Whereas if a doctor was a bit more open and understanding, I think they would feel more inclined to open up.
Very few of the people I see have not had adverse interactions and conversations with healthcare. And so if we can shift that conversation and make it more respectful, and look, it may not be that what I'm offering is what's going to work for you. That's okay. But we've had a respectful conversation, you know, and it's been curious, it's been caring. That's probably all. That's just integral to good outcomes, I think. Good life, yeah.
Appropriate language isn't just about political correctness. Language influences our thoughts and behaviors. For example, a study with clinicians as participants looked at the difference between the phrases having a substance use disorder and substance abuser, and found that the term substance abuser evoked more negative judgments. Clinicians saw substance abusers as more reckless and culpable in their behavior. Each of us is a product of our culture and experience. We have ingrained and possibly unconscious biases that can be unhelpful, particularly in clinical interactions. It's important to reflect on our language and how it affects the people around us. Terms like addict reduce a complex and multifaceted individual to one aspect of their behavior, drug use. Person-centered language, such as a person with alcohol dependence or a person with opioid use disorder, reaffirms that the individual is more than their drug use and supports positive change. Expressing concerns about risky behaviors can be done with sensitivity. For example, you can say, there are a number of risks around using heroin. How can we review some of these and talk about how you might use more safely, or even talk about treatments that work? Another option is to say, I'm sorry, I can't prescribe this medication because I don't think it's safe for you. However, let's look at other ways I can assist you. When you simply state, don't use heroin, or I won't prescribe this medication, you're potentially cutting the person off in front of you from really valuable information, advice, and support. Language is powerful, and sensitive language is important to providing great care. This video focuses on the story of people with lived or living experience of drug use and how language affects them.